Assalamu my dudes, and welcome back to PLP Green. Today I bought an Exoterra reptile tank off Facebook Marketplace. I'm going to be building a enclosure for my Perrin's tree frogs. There is a little bit of work to be done, of course, but first step is to wash it out. The only problem with this tank was the lid. A heat lamp has warped the plastic in the past, and there's water damage on the metal mesh. In the end, I just decided to rebuild the whole lid. I used this fly screen mechanism and measured out the dimensions and built a square to fit. I decided to use a fiberglass mesh instead of a metal one because I know that this setup is going to be quite humid and I didn't want any more rusting to occur. When dealing with the background of a setup, a lot of people like to use expanding foam and silicone, but I like to keep my tanks reusable, so I always try and find a way to make my background semi-permanent instead of permanent. In this case, I simply use zip ties and some suction caps to attach the background at the top. The bottom of the background will just be held in place by the substrate. The background that came with the tank is a pretty good quality one, but I thought I could add some more realism to it and some more intricate details by using silicone to attach some rocks to the surface. I then used a pump system with some irrigation tubing to set up a spraying system which would constantly spray the background to create a waterfall effect. This was very experimental, but it worked out quite well in the end. The small AquaPro pump that I bought fit comfortably behind the synthetic background. To create a more layered effect to the setup and some more spaces for my frogs to hide in, I went and got these mangrove driftwood pieces. Using some modelling foam, I made some little stands that would keep the mangrove logs standing up straight. Again, I didn't want to silicone the logs too permanently into the tank in case I change this setup later in the future. 24 hours later, after the silicone had cured, they were looking pretty good and they were quite stable. I wanted the cracks and crevices in the logs to be facing upward to a degree so I could put in things like bromeliads and other ferns. To stop the foam from floating up in the water, I just put tiny dabs of silicone on the bottom. Then using a spoon, I simply carved away parts of the modelling foam so I could fit in a bank of rocks. I decided to use some silicone to attach some of the larger rocks to the foam, as I knew I was going to be moving this enclosure to my classroom at the school I teach at. I was pretty happy with the result, and these rocks will make a great structure for the rest of the landscape. While finding different parts of the hardscape, I tried to keep the tone or the colours quite similar. They all have a slightly mustardy yellow colour to them, and I wanted to keep this for consistency's sake. I added a layer of red lava rock as water permeates through it really easily, and it's a great substrate for aquatic plants to grow in. With a UV light added and a plant growing light, we were ready to plant. Here's the setup with the waterfall running. Looks really cool. Even without plants, I was super happy with the functionality of it. I decided to start with the bromeliads, so I stuffed each of the mangrove driftwood logs full of damp sphagnum moss. I had a range of bromeliads to experiment with, and after some tinkering, I found that these ones were a little too big, and they just put the scale of the setup out. In the end, I used some smaller bromeliads, even though these two looked bloody cool. Now, this next part is a little controversial, but I didn't use any soil or substrate for this setup. I've found from growing terrestrial plants in my fish tanks that a lot of them will grow happily in just water and pebbles. The planting step of any setup is my favourite, and I'm always quite meticulous about it. In this case, I worked on it back and forth for a few days, waking up each morning to see if I had liked what I had done, and then quickly changing it. Building a setup over a few days is extremely important in my opinion. I always like to see it with fresh eyes, and sometimes it gives you a bit more perspective and you can use your creativity to perfect your build. As I'm keeping some Australian native tree frogs in here, I needed to heat the water, so I dropped a heater in behind the background. The little rocks that I siliconed into the background were really helpful in creating small pockets that I could push sphagnum moss and ferns into. It was this point that I brought the setup to school. I knew the last few stages were going to be quite a delicate procedure and I didn't want them damaged in transport. For the final stages of planting, I added in some aquatic pond plants and some ground cover in the form of baby tears. This stuff grows prolifically and really well without any soil. All it needs is continuous moisture and it will perk up and grow like crazy. I put in some different sized rocks around the bank just to cover up the last bits of blue foam and to give it that natural look, or as best natural as I could. For the final touches on the background, I added some small patches of terrestrial moss on some of the rock ledges. I also added some of this terrestrial moss on the sphagnum moss that was holding the bromeliads in place. They look loose now, but give them a couple of months and they will be very secure. It was time to move my little froglets into the setup. These guys are native to Australia and they are Perrin's tree frogs. So cute, look at him. After letting the frogs settle in for a couple of days, I went to the enclosure and fed them a few crickets, which they gobbled up quite quickly. And I was really impressed with how the plants and the entire setup were holding up. Everything was rooting and growing in. These baby tears had perked up and they were leaning towards the light. There was no dieback, which is a great sign, and everything seemed to be running smoothly. The changes in the upcoming weeks that I might make are putting a timer on the waterfall and only letting it run for certain times of a day, so the moss and plants aren't wet 24 hours a day. It's always a good sign when it's difficult to find your animals in an enclosure. It usually means that they've taken to their new habitat and they're enjoying the scenery. Thanks for watching. See you next time on PLB Green.